What's up guys, Justin Morgan here, Carved Up Vegan Muscle, and today's video is going to tackle the topic of overtraining. And I'm going to wager to say that the majority of all lifters that talk about overtraining, in fact, are probably not actually overtrained. Not that overtraining doesn't exist, but it is a very chronic problem that very few people get into, and that is very, very difficult to get into. And so I'm going to talk more about other aspects of overtraining. This is largely based off an article that was written by Mike Tuchscherer. The title of the article is "You Are Not Overtrained," same as this video. Mike Tuchscherer is a Raw IPF World's gold medal winning powerlifter. He has coached 12 national champions, 2 IPF world record holders, as well as many other national competitors that compete also in geared powerlifting. To say that he is a valuable resource on the topics of training principles that involve muscle growth is somewhat of an understatement. Obviously, his information is geared towards strength athletes more so than bodybuilders, but muscle is muscle. Overtraining has been a buzzword for several generations of lifters now in the American meathead culture. And meanwhile, in like Russia, Bulgaria, and other Eastern Bloc countries, the opposite has been the case. They seem to be more concerned with increasing the total volume and work that an athlete can do over their career and increasing their ability rather than limiting the work that they can do in fear of overtraining. In the description box below, I will paste a link to Mike's article, "You Are Not Overtrained." It's well worth for you to check out. In the article, Mike addresses some excellent points on how the human body is an extremely adaptive organism. Personally, I would say that the #1 defense mechanism that the human body has as a species is that we are exactly that, so adaptive. We adapt to a variety of different eating patterns, environments, weather, seasons, and many other living conditions. So adapting to training volumes is just another aspect of how the human body is capable of doing extraordinary things. The problem with our training philosophies, though, is that we often shortchange some of those training adaptations when we stop, because we are sore, fatigued, we feel achy, we feel pain, or any other reasons that someone might come up with. And most certainly, there are times when we should hold back. Obviously, an injured athlete doesn't get stronger, at least not until they're healthy again. But oftentimes, we don't pull back the training volume because we are in danger of getting injured. We take a deload or try some other form of limiting the amount of work that we are able to do because we are afraid of overtraining, when in reality, if we allowed ourselves to be sore, to be fatigued for a period of increased training volume, we would find that we start to adapt to the higher volumes. Now, I am going to go ahead and throw out the caveat. I'll go ahead in a little bit and I'll explain further the aspects of fatigue and increasing your overall training volume and workload. But first, why should we adapt to higher volumes? What would be the benefit? Dr. Brad Schoenfeld of LookGreatNaked.com, yes, that is a real website. No, it is not a dirty website. But him, among other researchers, has found that training volume is the primary driver of muscle growth. In the linked article that I mentioned earlier by Mike Tuchscherer, he states that intensity determines your training effect, as in what happens to your body as a result of the training. Volume, however, determines mostly the magnitude of that effect, as in how much of the training effect you get. Over the course of a career, if an athlete or bodybuilder wishes to continue to progress, they must continue to increase their overall training volume. So how do you increase your training volume? One thing I don't really recommend is that you go from a low training volume suddenly into an extremely high training volume. If you are regularly making good progress on a 3-day-a-week, 5x5 full body style lifting program, then it doesn't really make much sense to suddenly start training 7 days a week for 2 to 3 hours per day. Your joints, connective tissue, and nervous system will have a difficult time, or at least a more difficult time, adapting to such a dramatic increase in stimulus, in training stimulus. However, if you've been training on the same 3-day-a-week 5x5 full body style training program that I mentioned, and you get to a point where you stall out for a while, then you would likely benefit from adding in a 4th training day where you train the lifts that are probably more accessory movements at weights that you can move really quickly or easily. For example, adding in a pause squat or front squat or a close grip bench press or floor press, and maybe say pull-ups rather than just doing the same things that you would normally do, like squats, bench presses, or overhead presses, or rows, or pull-ups, or rows or deadlifts or something like that, then that would be a good way to do that. Other movements could be utilized, but I chose those specific examples of a general strength and conditioning program for a recreational type lifter. I am of the opinion that 5x5 programs are very great general lifting programs, and despite the claims that they are bodybuilding or that they are powerlifting programs, they neither are really ideal lifting paradigms for bodybuilding or powerlifting. Rather, I would say they set the lifter up to be a well-conditioned to choose and in a position to choose to specialize in any aspect of training that requires muscle and strength. The Bulgarian-style weightlifting team, or the Bulgarian weightlifting team itself, use the above-mentioned process for adding in days of the week until at some point their lifters, over the course of a career, were training 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. That usually looked like 2 to 3 different sessions per day, 7 days out of the week. And they would take every 4th week as an unloading week, and once a year they would take 3 straight unloading weeks. So an unloading is like a deload, except that the lifter reduces their weights by around 20%. So they're doing about 80% of their normal intensity, and they cut the total volume at least in half. So that will look different for different people, but the initial effect of increased volume typically for most people will result in getting weaker. You feel, because you're more fatigued, and as you're more fatigued, you end up not being able to exert the normal amount of force that you might at other times. So I see a lot of people that follow different types of programs, and they'll say, I tried out Small Off or something like that, and it just didn't work. That really high frequency, high training volume, it didn't work for me. And then they'll go on to some other kind of lower intensity, lower volume program, and suddenly they'll blow up. I had that experience myself, which I'll probably cover in another video at some point, but I had enough foresight to kind of recognize that it was the daily training on squats and other things that I was doing that kind of initiated the increases in squat that I was getting when I went on to a lower training volume program. So I'll just leave that as it is. Next question, can a drug-free lifter train like the Bulgarians? I really don't know. The Bulgarians notoriously failed several drug tests in the midst of their most successful years. The Russians, in their research, Russian weightlifting research, found that to increase their training volume came to very similar conclusions, although they chose to implement it very differently than kind of how the Bulgarians did. Whereas the Bulgarians worked almost exclusively at low rep ranges, like primarily ones, singles, doing 1 rep maxes or somewhere near their max. The Russian methods have used higher rep ranges with the same concepts of increasing training volume. In both cases, though, the top-level athletes over the course of their career were practicing or moving towards programming that consisted of daily full-body training. I think this concept of training the body as one unit is the best option for a drug-free lifter, and the volume should be added over the course of months and years rather than jumping ideally, that way ideally rather than jumping into such a training philosophy all at one time where you're doing extremely high volumes all at once. Even then, some people may find that they just were genetically not cut out for training volumes of pro athletes. Or in another scenario, much like myself, an athlete that has to take care of their family, drive kids around, work a 40-hour work week at a normal job, and embrace the normal stresses that life can't realistically follow such a training concept. Every person, no matter who you are, though, can maximize the time that they have. Their progress may be slower, and they may never realize their maximum potential, in general as an athlete, but there have been enough very high-level athletes and bodybuilders that had all those responsibilities that still managed to compete at high levels. That very scenario leads me to believe that the majority of us can be successful even if we can't train at an ultra-high frequency. And high volumes of training that the Bulgarians and Russians use, in other words, just because you can't train 7 days a week, 8 hours a day, or however that scenario might look differently, that doesn't mean you can't maximize the time that you do have and increase your frequency and training volume within the limits that you have. So those are just some of my thoughts on training volume and frequency within the lifts. I do practice very high frequency. I can't always do that in terms of like training very high frequency and high volume, but over the course of a week, if you only doing very small amounts of volume per day, that adds up over the course of the week, and you end up actually doing pretty high volume. So I think for drug-free lifters, more frequency is better. So I'll leave it at that. It's been a long video. Sorry. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I will talk to you in the next one. You guys take it easy. Remember to like, share, and subscribe.